So we're still talking about the first of these three dimensions that I mentioned, the theory itself, the interactional theory of conflict that underlies the transformative approach. And I want to talk about the last piece of that theory, which is that diagonal line across the conflict transformation diagram, which is referring to the part of our theory that says what people want most, what they care most about in conflict, is not some set of needs and interests, or some set of legal rights, or some rebalancing of power. What they care most about, as much as any of those other things, and maybe more, is changing the interaction between them from negative and destructive back to positive and constructive, which we could say, if that happens, probably all of those other things will happen too. But that's what they care about. Why? Well, that's what I want to talk about now. Why? Because if we put it this way, that goes to our belief about who are these people that we're working with? Who are these people that we are quote unquote helping? Which also goes to the question of what kind of help do they want? So our theory is resting ultimately on some very, very deeply held premises or beliefs about our clients as human beings and the social process that they're involved with. Our beliefs are, and everybody has beliefs, and that's one of the things about our framework that, again, we think is unique, which is that we articulate those beliefs. We put them right out there in front. We don't hide them. We don't not consider them ourselves. We try to understand what are our own underlying beliefs that lead us to look at conflict in this way and explain them to ourselves and to people who are listening to us. So the most important of those beliefs are the following. Number one, we believe that human beings, all human beings, have both a social and an individual character. They're both individual beings, but they're individual beings with strong social connections. And they are motivated by, primarily, what we think of as a moral impulse to act with both strength and compassion. To act with strength, with agency, with their own control of their own lives, and to act with a recognition of their social connection and bonds and obligations to each other. Strength and compassion. To be neither victim nor victimizer. To interact humanely with each other in all their relations, including conflict, and regardless of the circumstances and the structures that may surround them. So that's a belief about motivation, about human motivation. Human motivation is a very positive, powerful drive towards articulation and expression of the self and connection with other. Both of those are interrupted when conflict, negative conflict, occurs. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second assumption is that all human beings, regardless of their circumstances, are not only motivated to act with agency and connection, agency and empathy, but have the capacities, the inherent capacities for self-determined choice and responsiveness to others, even when they're confronted with adverse circumstances and even when constrained by institutional forces and cultural forces. But they have the inherent, innate capacity to act with self-determined choice or agency and connection to each other or empathy, agency and empathy. So they have the desire to act with agency and empathy, and they have the capacity to act with agency and empathy at all times, no matter what the constraints are. To some degree, they can exercise those choices and those capacities. So if that's true, if that's what we believe about our fellow human beings, and by the way, let me just say, that's not what everybody believes. We call that an asset view of the human being. The human being has fundamental, powerful assets to act in their own interests and at the same time to recognize and feel connections with each other. They have the assets of the capacity for both agency and empathy. It's possible, and there are others who would say, no, human beings actually don't have those assets. Actually, according to some, they lack assets in both of those areas. We lack capacity for clear, rational thinking and analysis because our brains are hardwired with cognitive deficits. And we lack the capacity for empathy and connection because our brains are hardwired to suspect each other, to misinterpret each other, and mistrust each other. And there's a substantial literature that says those deficits are fundamental in human beings. So essentially, we are openly rejecting that view, rejecting the deficit view of the human being, and instead adopting an asset view of the human being, a very positive. People say, this is a very positive view of human beings, isn't it? And we say, yes, guilty as charged. We have a very positive view of who we are, all of us, as human beings. Now, if our view is true, and human beings have this impulse to act with self-determination, choice, and agency, and also with consideration for each other and empathy, then the meaning of conflict that is most salient to them is that it gets in the way. It disables those capacities temporarily. It interrupts them. And instead they find themselves alienated from their own selves, basically. Not just from each other, but their own selves and their own fundamental capacities. That's what makes conflict so bitter and difficult, is this loss of our innate capacities to act out, as some of our colleagues say, out of our best selves. Instead of acting out of our best selves, we find ourselves acting as our worst selves. And that's what most disturbs us, more than anything else, when we're involved in conflict. And that's what destructive conflict interaction is like. And therefore, the thing that is the most valuable product of conflict intervention, or if we want to put it that way, the help that people want most from mediators or interveners or facilitators, is the help in moving back from destructive to constructive conflict, from regaining a sense of connection to their own capacities for agency and empathy, for self-determined decision-making and consideration from other. We've temporarily lost them. Situationally, it's very difficult to hold on to them sometimes. When we lose them, what we want most of all is to regain our connection to ourselves, to our most fundamental, essential selves. And so, again, all of these are beliefs about what human beings are as a matter of fundamental human identity, and therefore what bothers them most about conflict, and therefore what they most want in terms of the help from an intervener. And we take the view that our clients have an inherent desire and an inherent capacity for agency or autonomy and for empathy and connection, although those have been temporarily disconnected, disabled by the conflict experience itself. And what we want from an intervener is to help us achieve and regain those capacities and achieve some kind of positive conflict interaction by supporting our inherent capacities for strength and compassion. So that's a full packed picture of what the theory is, including the underlying beliefs. And we accept that these are beliefs, and other people may have different ones, about the nature of human beings themselves, ourselves, as entities. What role does that theory then posit for an intervener? That's the next point of this theory that I want to emphasize, and that is the role of an intervener for us goes to the second thing that I said was unique about what I believe our theory has to offer, and that is we take self-determination, client self-determination, seriously. What does that mean? What it means is that for us, the role of an intervener in any third-party intervener in a mediative process, whether it's mediation or it's dialogue or it's something similar to those, the role of the intervener is to support and never supplant party decision-making, party perspective-taking. Why is that? I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but let's just think about that for a minute. Support and never supplant. Anything that I do as an intervener, and there'll be another, I think, video for you about the practices of transformative dialogue, all my practices have to be in some way or another supporting the parties in their making decisions and reconnecting with each other, rather than supplanting the decisions that they may make, or forcing them, or pushing them, or nudging them. Support and never supplant. That's what I would say is our slogan. And all the practices that we developed over many years actually involve exactly that. Practices like, which you'll hear more about, reflection and summary and checking in and backing out, getting out of the party's ways. All of those are ways of supporting the party's exchange in a mediation or a dialogue process. And those are the practices we use. Now, why do we use them? And why don't we use other practices? Because these practices are designed and calculated to support the party's own decision-making process, including the decision of how they look at each other and how they look at the situation. There is, of course, an alternative to that. The alternative is to become more forceful. To occasionally, my students always ask me when I teach mediation, at some point, the question is, well, can't we do a little bit of supplanting? Can't we come in there with, actions of our own in some ways, especially when it doesn't seem to be working simply to support the parties? And so I usually ask them, what do you mean it's not working? Working to do what? Well, it's not working to move closer to an agreement. It's not working to get the parties to be more recognizing of each other. It's not working to get them to be fairer to each other. And so my comment to my students is, we are not trying to get the parties to do anything. We let parties do things. We don't get them to do things. As soon as you think in terms of getting them to do things, you're no longer talking about supporting them. You're talking about supplanting them. Now, why shouldn't we sometimes anyway, when things get really tough and we're not making quote unquote any progress? Progress towards what? Towards an agreement, towards reconciliation, towards a just outcome. Well, who says those are the targets? The target is to help the parties change the quality of their interaction from negative and destructive to positive and constructive. That won't happen if an intervener gets the parties, either of them, to do something. Why not? Because when you get parties to think more clearly about a situation, to be more open about a situation, to be less hostile, when I do things that get a party to do that, I'm basically driving them back from strength to weakness. I'm basically saying to them, hey, you can't do this for yourself. Let me show you what to do. Follow my lead. We never ask parties to follow our lead. We follow the parties rather than trying to lead them or push them or get them to do things. So if I slip into, which is a very difficult thing to avoid, I myself have fallen prey to it, and I actually wrote a whole chapter in the first edition of our book, The Promise of Mediation, that demonstrates yours truly trying to get the parties to give each other recognition. Well, that was a pretty bad example, but at the time, I didn't realize it. So since then, I've learned that, no, that's not what we are intended to be doing. That's not what we intend to do. What we intend to do is to support and never supplant. Why? Because whenever I supplant, I short-circuit the empowerment shift. I short-circuit the parties regaining their sense of their own competency and agency. And instead, I reinforce their sense that they don't have the right stuff. I reinforce their sense of incompetence and weakness and lack of agency. And if I do that, the conflict transformation cycle is, as a whole, aborted. Conflict transformation begins with the empowerment shift, when parties come back to themselves and then begin to be able to reach out to each other. If I make it hard or impossible for them to come back to themselves by sending the message that, sit back and let me do this for you, then I have essentially stalled, short-circuited the entire conflict transformation process. I may indeed produce an agreement. I may indeed get them to recognize each other. I may indeed guarantee some kind of just result. What I didn't do, and what I can't do if I'm intervening in that way, is to support conflict transformation, is to help the parties move back from destructive conflict interaction to positive conflict interaction. That requires supporting and never supplanting what the parties want to do. Whether it's what they want to do about whether they want to meet with each other, when they want to meet with each other, how they want to talk to each other, what kind of ground rules they want or don't want, what they think the issues are, how they want to talk about them, in what order they want to talk about them, and what they want to do about them. Every single one of those dimensions is the subject of party choice. As one of our colleagues, my colleague Eric Clevin, wrote about in a white paper and an article called Who Needs to Talk to Whom About What and When and How. That's what we do, is to help people think about those questions and answer the questions for themselves. That's what it means to support and never supplant. And that's the most important nature of our conflict transformation practice. That's what we mean by taking self-determination seriously. Taking seriously the fact that the parties are the ones who get to make the choices about who to talk to, what to talk about, when to talk about it, how to talk about it, when to stop talking, when to keep talking. Every single one of those things is a party choice. And our job as interveners is to support those choices, never to supplant them. So some people say, well, what are you going to do? You're going to sit there and do nothing because there's nothing that you can do. What are you supposed to do? So I'm going to leave that to the person that talks to you about practices, because in fact, transformative practice is very active. It's not passive at all. It's not directive. It's not supplanting, but it's not passive. And there are many positive things that we do, we can do, and we actually do to support party decision making. In the first 10 years between the first edition of Promise of Mediation and the second one, when we first started teaching this process, we only taught people what we thought they should not do. In other words, we talked about not supplanting. And we got very good at doing that. Unfortunately, people would then say, well, what am I supposed to do? And we didn't have any answers to that question. Gradually, we learned from each other, from watching each other intervene and mediate and facilitate, and from videotaping ourselves, and then analyzing those videotapes, we began to see, oh, there are positive things that we can do that don't constitute supplanting party decision-making. And those are the things that we can do. And then we began to teach people how to do those things, which I'm going to let you learn from someone else on another video in this training program. But the key thing is to understand why the general principle of practice, support and never supplant, is totally connected to the framework itself and the premises of the framework, which are that the most important things you can do are to help parties make empowerment shifts and then recognition shifts, and to help them do that because that's what they want to do, most of all, to return to positive and constructive interaction. So if that's what they want, and that's what you're trying to help them to do, then the practices that you adopt must be, logically and practically and meaningfully, practices that support and never supplant party decision-making, including the decision about whether to view each other differently and to understand each other differently and to understand the situation differently than they did before. But those are their choices. Those are their choices, how to see those things. And those have to remain their choices if we are going to be effective in helping people to in fact succeed in conflict transformation. Now, if that's not what we want to do, if that's not our goal, if that's not our role as interveners, okay, fine. Then you can go right ahead and do things that involve supplanting party decision making. But we're going to ask you, and we're going to ask ourselves in these practices, in this approach to dialogue and to mediation and to intervention, we're going to ask you to adopt the goal of conflict transformation and to understand that that's what the parties are ultimately looking for, and to therefore understand that in practice itself, we have to learn ways of supporting what parties choose to do rather than supplanting it, rather than getting parties to do things. And in fact, whenever we start thinking about how do I get the parties to do X, Y, Z, that's a danger signal. That's a signal that we need to pull back and recenter ourselves and say, wait a minute, that's not what I'm supposed to be doing here. That's not what I want to be doing here. And then begin to look for ways to support and not supplant. I think that's really what I want to basically say to you. And I hope that's been useful and that it covers the territory. We talked about the interactional view of conflict. We talked about taking self-determination seriously. That's the meaning of support and never supplant. And we talked about the premises and beliefs that underlie this entire framework about the people that we work with and ourselves, that we have a positive asset view of our clients as human beings, that they have both the desire and the capacity for agency, for self-determined choice, and for empathy, for genuinely chosen connection with and understanding of each other. So I hope that's helpful to you and that it lays a foundation for what comes after this. And I'm glad you're taking this course.